In a room lined with portraits that never looked like him, a young man stood and stopped a fortune mid-sentence. The ink wasn't dry, the condolences barely cooled, when the genius son of a late black billionaire laid a sealed envelope on the mahogany table, and with it, the future. Eyes hardened, pens froze. Somewhere between grief and calculation, the dynasty forgot to breathe. He hadn't come to beg for a share. He had come to expose the truth his father knew would be challenged. What kind of secret could freeze an empire, silence old money, and reroute a legacy in one breath? He had grown up learning to read rooms before books. While other children counted marbles, he counted pauses, glances, doors that opened and doors that didn't. In time, he learned to build his own. Malik Cole was the son of Darius Cole, engineer, investor, builder of a sprawling logistics and tech empire that stretched from ports to data centers and into communities that had long been ignored. The headlines called Darius a titan. Malik called him a father who never left the hard lessons out of the story. Darius had been a first in too many rooms. First to pitch a network of distribution hubs when no bank saw him as credible. First to list a company in an index crowded with faces that didn't expect him to stay. He remembered the audits that came sooner, the contracts that came slower, the smiles that came thinner. He remembered the old guard insisting wealth had rules they wrote. The same old guard now waited for his estate. When Darius died unexpectedly, the city's skyline felt different to Malik. Towers that once gleamed looked like teeth. The Will Reading sat high above the financial district, glass walls framing a view that made anyone feel small. The law firm was old enough to ignore its reception area's gilded edges. The board representatives filed in with clipped steps, a few relatives with too bright condolences, and a hush that suggested more than grief. Malik arrived early. He carried a single, weathered envelope, dated in the careful hand of a man who knew time could be an enemy. His father had warned him without words. Plan for what people say when you can't answer back. Today, Malik wasn't there to be handed a share of anything. He was there to decide whether the legacy would be memory or momentum. Before going to the next part of the story, we have a request. As we have a dream to reach 1,000 subscribers, and without your support it won't be possible, so please help use to reach this milestone. Also share your thought in the comment and don't forget to watch the last interesting part of the story. Now let's get back to the story. The reading began like a ritual performed 1,000 times. Names were pronounced with professional neutrality. Numbers floated, percentages parceled, assets categorized so neatly they seemed airless. Control, it seemed, would pass into a succession council composed of senior board members, a family trustee, and an external advisory chair supplied by the very law firm hosting the reading. The room accepted the architecture with a studied calm. Malik felt the quiet shift, that subtle tilt when power finds its new center. He noticed, too, the parts that didn't fit. His father never believed in councils that diluted responsibility. He had trained Malik to build systems that resisted single points of failure, and to recognize them when someone tried to create one. The proposed council was a funnel by another name, channeling control into hands his father had never trusted. A codicil, dated 2 days after Darius slipped into a medically induced coma, transferred a decisive block of voting shares to a trust managed externally for stability. Stability was the word used when doors were closing. Malik had prepared for this. Months earlier, when the first anonymous calls pushed a measured transition, he had traced connections across shell entities, donations, and advisory roles that looped back to the same old corridors. He found timing irregularities in email metadata, digital signatures that looked right until you inspected the certificate chain, and a clause whose language didn't match the firm's prior drafts. He found more than a pattern. He found intent. In his bag, beneath the envelope, sat a drive wrapped in his father's precise caution. A set of notarized files and a video message recorded in better days. The files included a second will drafted with an independent attorney outside the network of expected influence. It bore a time-stamped, third-party notarization and a hash anchored to a public ledger 4 weeks before the coma. It had been verified, copied to cold storage, and then sealed with instructions that bordered on prophecy. Bring this only to the table where the first will is read. Faces shifted around the table as the legal cadence continued. A cousin fidgeted at the phrase, subject to counsel discretion. A board member traced the rim of a glass when philanthropic commitments were labeled aspirational. The advisory chair cleared a throat. A portrait of long-dead founders watched from the wall, a curated lineage that never needed to ask for entry. When the codicil took shape on paper, Malik felt the air move. The line that mattered assigned operational veto to the external chair in extraordinary circumstances. Extraordinary had always been a story told by those in charge. He stood. The act disrupted more than sound. The halt was visual, visceral. Pens hung above paper. Eyes lifted. Time widened. Malik placed the envelope on the table as if setting down a key in a room that denied the existence of the door. Inside, the independent will waited, its seal still unbroken. Alongside it, the cryptographic proofs, the notarized affidavits, and a letter that felt, in his bones, like a father's hand on his shoulder. He knew the cost of being the one to interrupt a script written by power. He had learned, from years of subtler rooms, that the first challenge is not evidence, it's belief. Belief that a black man could be the custodian of a future rather than a guest in it. Belief that a son's clarity could outrun a firm's choreography. He took the risk anyway. The room's composure fractured in small ways. A pause too long, a glance too sharp, a jaw that set. Malik placed the drive beside the envelope. The skyline beyond the glass looked unchanged, but inside the room, a different city began to emerge. A dynasty, in the mirror, prepared to meet its most delicate truth. The world compressed into file names and dates. The attorneys traced chain of custody like mapmakers relearning coastlines. The independent will's timestamp predated the coma. Its language bore Darius's unmistakable structure. Direct, protective, impatient with vagueness. The accompanying documentation outlined a plan designed to outlive manipulation. It placed 51% of voting shares into an irrevocable trust with a governing council composed of employees from across the company, community leaders from neighborhoods the business relied on, and a chair selected for integrity rather than pedigree. The son would serve as steward, not monarch, accountable to the people whose labor made the empire possible. On the screen, a pre-recorded message from Darius played without flourish. His voice, captured on a day when his health was still a private matter, carried the weight of a man who had seen walls move behind polite smiles. He laid out the temptations that arrive when legacy is in the air. Alliances that masquerade as stability, offers that trade dignity for calm, signatures that make theft look like order. He named no enemies and framed no vendettas. He described systems that had once told him he did not belong. He acknowledged that some would try to reframe his final wishes when he could no longer contest them. Then came the core of the secret. Evidence that the Stability Trust in the first will had been proposed by parties with financial ties to entities quietly shorting the company during rumors about his health. Emails, meeting minutes, and draft language showed a choreography designed to slow-walk control away from the family and toward a gate-kept circle. The second will, created in anticipation of such pressure, rendered those maneuvers moot by moving power to a structure they could not silently capture. The room's oxygen changed. The external chair's legal smile became effortful. Relatives calculated new math in real time. Board members who had stayed silent began evaluating risk not measured in dollars but headlines. The attorneys paused the reading, compelled by the gravity of the evidence and the implications of a time-stamped instrument that would supersede their narrative. On the table, legacy ceased to be a commodity and became a conviction. The question hung unsaid but heavy. Would the law honor the planning of a black patriarch who knew exactly how power behaves when it is losing its grip? What followed was not tidy, because real reckonings never are. The court took weeks to validate the independent will, to interrogate timestamps, to interview the separate counsel and examine the digital signatures with the kind of care rarely afforded to rumors but now demanded by reality. The law firm faced scrutiny it had long sidestepped. Regulators opened inquiries into trading patterns that clustered neatly around hospital whispers. A journalist pieced together a timeline and found a story within a story, a pattern replayed across decades, where black-built prosperity met old routes of control. When the ruling came, it felt like a door finally acknowledged. The independent will stood. The codicil that conjured extraordinary oversight collapsed under its own contradictions. Control shifted to the trust Darius designed. Employees who had never stepped into that high-glass room were invited to help shape the council. Community leaders who lived with the company's trucks and warehouses saw their neighborhoods show up as line items with agency, not outreach with a hashtag. Malik did not become a king. He became a custodian. He visited the ports at dawn and the data center floors at midnight. He met with engineers and drivers, with warehouse supervisors and coders, with the small business owners who fed the company's workers at lunch. He listened to the stories that never made it into earnings calls. He greenlit initiatives his father had drafted in margins. Scholarship pipelines from overlooked schools, procurement goals with local Black-owned vendors, equity programs that let longtime employees become stakeholders in more than spirit. Not everyone celebrated. The old guard regrouped behind subtler doors, framing the shift as instability, the trust as idealism. Some allies revealed themselves as conditional. But the company steadied itself around a different center of gravity, one that refused to outsource its conscience. The video of Darius's message leaked and spread, not as spectacle but as a blueprint. Families argued and made peace in living rooms. Young professionals replayed it on commutes and felt a different kind of ambition form behind their ribs. In the end, the will reading was not a battle for a fortune. It was a battle for meaning. Wealth had been the stage, not the story. The dynasty shattered was not a family. It was the old idea that power should always flow to the same hands. The question lingers, as it should. When the next legacy is on the table, who will be trusted to carry it? Those who built the future, or those who only expect to inherit it?